Hello and welcome everybody to a special edition of the Pokerfuse Podcast. I'm your host Mike Gentili, and today, instead of bringing you our normal news-focused show, we are going to be conducting an interview with none other than poker author David Sklansky. David is author of 16 poker and gambling books and is a 3-time World Series of Poker bracelet winner. David was kind enough to take some time out of his schedule and answer some questions about his new book, The Theory of Poker Applied to No Limit. But before we dive in with David, I'd like to ask for listeners' feedback. We often ask listeners to chime in and let us know what they think of the show. We're particularly interested in what you think about this type of format. We don't see it as replacing our other format, but more a supplemental type format to do some cool interviews from time to time with people that have things to say in the industry. So if you like the format or if you don't like the format, please let us know. You can tweet at us at Pokerfuse, or I am at SpookyBugs, and you can tweet at Nick Jones as well, even though he's not here today. He is at PokerProJones. That being said, let's dive right in with David. David, thanks for joining us and taking some time out of your schedule. I'm just going to jump right in. So, David, who's the audience for this book? You know, what can new poker players learn from this book, and maybe what can experienced poker players learn as well?
The main audience, of course, are those people who have already read The Theory of Poker. And but there are plenty of people who haven't who would also benefit from the book. It's probably the greatest benefit to intermediate players. Beginners would have to probably move up to intermediate before they could appreciate the book. As far as advanced players, I would say that 70% of the book contains information that they pretty much already know, instinctively, if not precisely. But let's face it, if you are an advanced player who's playing in big games, and there is even one thing in the book that you hadn't thought of, the book pays for itself by that one thing. And I would say that the typical advanced player is going to find several things that they haven't thought of. Also, let's face it, if you are an advanced player who is playing against intermediate players, you kind of have to read this book just to know what they've been reading.
Good point.
So, right now it's only $23 on Amazon, and the original book is like $13. So,
mine's got a price tag of $29.95 on it.
The original one has a price tag of $29.95, but Amazon's trying to put Barnes and Noble out of business. So their best sellers they tremendously discount.
I see.
And they often do that. And so if somebody is playing, is risking hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to for their profession, I guarantee that there will be at least 5 things in this book that they will say, you know what, I hadn't thought of that. He's right. And, of course, the intermediate players are going to really benefit, I think.
A lot, yeah. You've written many of the most authoritative books on poker. What prompted you to write this one?
Actually, it was a discussion with my son, who many people know is the general manager of 2+2. And we were just talking about the business. And he mentioned to me that even to this day, the original book, The Theory of Poker, not only is the best-selling book ever, but it is still the best-selling book. He said, it's not selling at nearly the rate as it did a few years ago, but it still sells better than all other books as far as the Amazon ratings are concerned. And when he said that, I actually felt badly and a little bit concerned, because I knew that all these people, therefore, are still reading this book, which has very little, no limit in it, and has an awful lot about stuff that nobody plays anymore, 7-card stud and various limit games, res, whatever. And in spite of that, people are still buying the book. And obviously the reason they are is because the underlying logic is usually applicable to all games. However, I also knew that because of the nature of No Limit, mainly that you can bet whatever you want rather than be forced to bet a specific amount, meant that the people who are reading the book are being forced to interpolate what's in that original book to No Limit. And sometimes that's not easy. And in a few cases, if they're going by the recommendations of the original book, they're actually doing something wrong when they're playing No Limit. So when Matt told me that this book is still being read by so many people who I know are playing almost exclusively No Limit, I said, well, wait a second. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of things in that original book that could be adjusted to No Limit. And right now, people are on their own trying to figure out the best way to adjust. And I realized that I could go through that book and I could properly explain the adjustments that should be made. And I started to go through the book and think about the different things that you could say about each of the chapters. And I said to Mason, I said, there's a whole other book that can be written that follows the chapters of the original theory of poker. Sometimes even quoting from the original, something that no one else could do. So this is a book that no one else could do without going to jail, because I'm quoting from myself.
Right.
It's fairly extensive. About 10% of the book is quotes from the original book. I do that on purpose because I don't want people to think that they need to buy the original book if they haven't already. It wouldn't hurt to do that, but a lot of people, that original book sold about 500,000 copies. So a lot of people have that book, and they can just go along and see how I go from chapter to chapter. The chapters are actually the exact same chapters, except that the new book has added about 10 new chapters, but which we call bonus chapters. But this new book, the name of each of the chapters is the same, aside from the bonus chapters. And in each chapter, I basically say, here is how you would have to adjust from what was in the original book if you're playing No Limit. And it was actually fairly simple for me to do that because it is just logical. But that's my specialty, is to take the logic of something that I want to convey and explain it. And so anybody who knows the original book, or even just reads the quotes in this new book, the quotes from the old book, that is, I explain how you change your strategies if, in fact, you can bet whatever you want. And so it was a natural thing. I should have done it 10 years ago, but I didn't.
Well, before we dive into some of the differences, I am an owner of one of the, one of the original versions of the Theory of Poker, though mine is probably a lot newer than most. I'm looking at it right now, and it says I have the 9th edition, and it looks like the original copyright date was 1987. Can you tell us a bit about the history or the evolution of the Theory of Poker?
The original book? Yes. Well, the absolutely original book wasn't even called The Theory of Poker. It was called Sklansky on Poker Theory. It was my second book after Hold'em Poker. And then I took the book to Prentice Hall, and they agreed to republish it using not the name The Theory of Poker, but the name Winning Poker, which I didn't like because I thought it was just too generic. And then the rights came back to me. I forget all the details, but then I got involved with Mason Malmuth, and we renamed it again the Theory of Poker. The original book, Sklansky on Poker Theory, was a little bit denser, and I got a professional writer to make it a little bit easier to go through, but it's pretty much been the same ever since that original. There's a few little changes here and there all the way back from 1987. But the bottom line was, I realized in 1987 that nobody had attempted to look at poker in a generalized, logical manner. They would talk about specifically how to play a hand or this and that, but they never really talked about specifically the things that you need to think about when you're in a poker hand. Someone bets. You have to think about what's the chances that he's bluffing. What's the next bet size? What's going to cost you if you're going to see him all the way to the river? If you make a good hand, how much will you be able? What's the chances that he'll call you? These generalized concepts nobody has ever written about, and I realized that there were so many different things in poker, so many general concepts, and for some reason, no one had ever thought to write about them. So when I did write it, lots of poker players, gravitated toward it because they realized that this is the general thought processes of a poker player. I used examples, but I rarely went as far as to say how to play a certain hand in a certain case. I would say something like, if you think that there's a 30% chance in your mind that he has you beaten, then you do such and such. And if you think that if you bet on the 4th Street, then that means that if you pair on 5th Street, he'll probably fold, and he was wrong to fold, or whatever. But if you don't think he will, then, all the different general ideas that poker makes you think about. In fact, I think that learning poker is a very useful trait, even if you're not going to be a serious poker player, because you can translate it into other areas of your life: risk versus reward, not getting upset when you have a losing day. Well, there's many different things that poker can teach you, and
you wrote a book on that, didn't you? Isn't that the...
Well, I wrote an article called "Poker is Good for You." Yes.
Okay.
And by the way, I think another thing that poker could be good for, and this could be, if they ever promoted it, they could be another resurgence in poker, especially internet poker, is I think that internet poker might be one of the easiest ways to take advantage of of this medical theory that people who play games are much less likely to get Alzheimer's. Doyle Brunson said that he knows of none of the old-time poker players who got Alzheimer's. And they say, that playing, doing crossword puzzles or playing bridge or doing logic puzzles, it stops. But one of the easiest ways would be to play 10 cent, 20 cent on the internet.
Yeah.
I mean, I came close to getting Caesar's Palace to agree to do some studies of all the past champions and see what percentage of them came down with Alzheimer's. And because I think, I think it's almost certain that poker players are much less likely to get Alzheimer's. They were reluctant because they were afraid that if they claimed it and it turned out not to be true, they could be sued. But imagine if there was some pretty good proof that the chances of getting Alzheimer's is cut in half if you start playing small stakes poker on the internet at below age 60. I mean, that would be an incredible upsurge.
Yeah, and it wouldn't even have to be that high of a percentage to make people stand up and take notice.
And people would start playing. I mean, they wouldn't play big games. I'm not saying you have to play big games, but if I was, I've mentioned this to a few internet poker site owners, and for some reason, they haven't pursued it. I guess it's because it would be quite difficult to do the study. But if this study ever came out and it was, because people don't want to do crossword puzzles. I mean, not too many people. It'd be so simple to just get on the internet and, spend $5 a day playing nickel dime poker.
Poker definitely seems to get the blood pumping a little bit more than crossword puzzles. I'll agree.
Yeah, and it's more fun. And so it's, but that we're digressing a little bit here from. But the point is that the reason why poker does that is because we have to think. 50 years ago, people used to think that poker was mainly bluffing. And I guess it was in the Cincinnati Kid when you're playing 5-card stud. See, when you're playing 5-card stud, it's almost all, does he have it or doesn't he? Period. There's very little understanding of the next few bets and the odds and all that. But once you start playing the more complicated games, there's a lot of different aspects to it. And I captured it quite well in the book, The Theory of Poker. That's why it's the best-selling book, even though it doesn't really tell you precisely how to play any game. And so it should be available about June 1st on Amazon, and it's called The Theory of Poker, Applied to No Limit. It's already available to be sold on Amazon, and there's an awful lot of changes, an awful lot. And there's also, in this book, there's, as I said, about 10 new chapters. There's also an appendix that reprints 3 relevant chapters from 2 other books that I've written. So altogether, it's like 310 pages. And there's all kinds of new thoughts in there that, I mean, some of them are fairly obvious, but they needed to be said. I mean, like, as an example, in the original Theory of Poker, I give a formula for whether you should go for a check raise on the river if you have the nuts. And the formula is related to the chances that if you bet, he'll call you, the chances that if you check, he'll bet, and the chances that if you check and he bets, that he'll call your check raise. And it's a simple formula. But the formula, if you use that formula when you're playing no limit, you're making a mistake, because in no limit, if you have the nuts and you're first, and you think he has a pretty good hand, he has a very good hand, but not a great hand. So in no limit, in limit, you would go for the check raise and probably get 2 bets out of him. But in a no limit game, if you're in that situation, you may very well be better off coming out betting, because your bet can be quite a bit bigger than what his bet would have been had you checked. See what I'm saying? So if we're playing 50 and 100 and a limit, and I check and he bets 100 and I raise 100, now I make 200 off of him when he calls me. But if we're playing no limit, I could just come right out betting 275 and make even more than a check raise would have. Whereas if I tried for a check raise, because we're playing no limit, maybe he's much less likely to call a check raise. He might even be scared and maybe less likely to bet. So this was just an example of the dozens of changes that should be made from the original book, because you're playing no limit, where you can bet whatever you want.
Yeah, when I first heard that the Theory of Poker Applied to No Limit was coming out, the one thing that popped in my mind, as I remember from reading the original, was you have a chapter on deception. and how that chapter differs depending on if you're playing no limit versus limit game.
Right, that would be an example.
Yeah. And is that something that you further clarify in the new no limit version?
Yes. It's funny. Unfortunately, I don't have the book in front of me because it doesn't exist, but I do have in front of me the manuscript, and I'm trying to remember. So you mentioned the value of deception was one of the chapters.
Right, and I remember in the original, you make some distinctions between when you should use deception in limit and when you should use deception in no-limit games. And these, if I recall, they were pretty significant differences.
Right. Well, in the original theory of poker, I would occasionally mention no limit. Very occasionally. Now, I'm leafing through my manuscript here now to get to that chapter and see what I said about that particular one. At the end of every chapter, I had something called the key points, and now in some chapters there's less than others, because in some chapters many of the same concepts still apply. In other chapters, because it's no limit, it doesn't. So I said, when deceiving your opponent into thinking you're likely to have a hand that's different from your actual hand, that's almost always valuable, and but how valuable it is depends on the size of the stacks, the skill of your opponent, the likelihood that your opponent will switch his strategy from a better one to a worse one, the difference in the EV there is between the strategy he would use if not deceived and the strategy he would use if he was, and then also as far as how important is it to try to stop your opponents from deceiving you. So in other words, obviously if you put your opponent on the incorrect hand, that helps him if he takes advantage of it. But depending on the situation, it will help you more in certain situations than other situations. So if you have two queens and your opponent puts in a very big raise, and he is trying to make you think he has aces or kings, but he decides that he will also try to deceive you and sometimes put in that very big raise with an ace king, and you are deceived and you think he only has aces or kings, but in fact he also could have ace king. That's not very important, because if you are up against somebody who has either aces, kings, or ace king, your two queens are still an underdog. So there was a case where being deceived barely hurt you, but if he threw in other hands where you were a big favorite, then he has gained a lot from his deception. If he in fact did succeed in, can you hear that? My bird in the background. If you can, I'm going to go to another room.
I can't.
You can,
but that's fine.
Okay. Well, yeah, I have an amazing parrot, but right now it seems to be carrying on in the other room. But the point is, these are things that can become very important in no limit, because in no limit, if you are putting somebody on the wrong hand, or if somebody is putting you on the wrong hand, it's disastrous to the person who's being deceived. In a limit game, most of the time, if the player knows that approximately the range of his opponent, and he's off a little bit, it doesn't matter, because he's getting such pot odds that he's going to call anyway. So yes, it's no limit deceiving your opponent is more important in no limit, or trying to deceive him, or trying to keep yourself from being deceived. You see, the other part about the deception chapter is the idea of finding out, doing something to find out if you're beaten. And let's say a small raise, he bets and now you raise. Now, in the limit poker, you'll hear about the idea of I'll raise to find out whether I'm beaten. And usually that is a bad play, because you're spending money to find out if you're beaten. And then when you find out that you're beaten, you're already getting such pot odds that you're going to probably have to call anyway. But in no limit, if, for instance, if you have, let's say, a pair of jacks, in no limit hold'em, and somebody raises before the flop, let's say, and let's say you call him, and now the flop comes 9-5-3, and now he bets on the flop, and you have two jacks. If you're up against a timid opponent who is not tricky, the right play would be to raise, with the idea being that if he re-raises you, you know you're beaten, and you only have two outs to draw out. And therefore, for a fairly small investment of a raise, you have found out that you only have two outs. So in no limit against a player who will cooperate by telling you whether or not he has you beaten, it's worth doing. Now, if you're playing no limit, however, against a person who will be uncooperative, then it's a terrible play, because suppose this player who you raise will just call you when he has two kings, by making you think that your two jacks are good. Then all you've done is waste money. Or, worse yet, suppose you're up against a player who will re-raise you without having your two jacks beaten. Then he's taken that whole pot away from you, because you've decided to make this play to find out so that you can get rid of the hand. But it will backfire terribly if he is somebody who is going to be uncooperative and re-raise with some other hand, ace king perhaps. So these are the things that yes, I go into a little more detail about it. In no limit, it's a whole different kettle of fish as far as being deceptive.
Okay, looking down the table of contents for the new book, I notice one of the new chapters that I don't see in my copy of The Theory of Poker is focused on game theory. What specifically about game theory makes it so relevant today?
Well, there is a chapter in the original book about game theory.
Oh, there is. I must have missed it.
Yeah.
Is there new information? I know
yes,
playing GTO is all of the rage today.
No, there's definitely. There is quite a bit of new. There was a chapter in the original book, and the original book mainly talked about a specific situation on the river where one player had a good hand and the other player was obviously drawing and either had made a great hand or had nothing at all. That was a very specific situation, and that was the only one that was covered in the original book. The more general game theory subject is for poker is quite a bit more complicated than that, because it covers not just situations on the river, but earlier situations, and not just situations where the person may either has the nuts or is just bluffing, but in between situations. The general idea of game theory is a little bit sad, actually, and I'm not a big fan of using a lot of game theory unless you're multi-tabling on the internet or playing world champions. But the general, strangely enough, if you play pure game theory, you no longer have to try to figure out what your opponent has. That's the sad part. In fact, and it's even worse, you can tell your opponent how you're going to play, and there's nothing he can do about it. So it's, in other words, I can tell you my strategy, and if my strategy is perfect game theory, you're handcuffed, and the best you can do is play the same way as me. If you try to, there's no way to exploit a game theory player. That's actually the key to game theory, which is that if I play a certain way, which includes randomizing. In other words, I might say, well, I'll raise with two aces 70% of the time, and I'll just call 30%. That's part of the game theory strategy. But if you play perfect game theory, nobody can beat you. And if they don't play approximately the same way that you do, they will lose to you. That's why it's such a favorite of these grinders who multi-table, because they just know that if they just stick to this strategy, they will grind out money. The problem with game theory is that if you stick to game theory, you're unbeatable, but you don't win nearly as much as you could against weak players. Game theory players don't win as much as they should against weak players. That's why in tournaments, the winners of the tournaments are not often game theory players, because in tournaments you have weak players, and game theory players have less of an edge against them than exploitive players. And even though I do explain in some detail what it means to play game theory, I also discourage it in many cases.
Interesting.
And talk about how you should play. I mean, for instance, if you're up against somebody who doesn't call big bets on the river hardly ever, you should bluff more often than what game theory would recommend, because it's going to work more often than game theory assumes. Because when they calculate game theory, it's kind of weird. They assume that the other player is playing game theory. And if he's not playing game theory, that's good for you. But if he's not playing game theory, it's even better for you if you also don't play game theory, as long as you're adjusting properly. So if I know that you're not playing game theory and I decide to play game theory, I will beat you. If I decide, however, to try to take advantage of my knowledge that you're not playing game theory, I'm taking a chance that I'm going to lose, because I need to come up with a different strategy, the one that will work best against you, and it might backfire. So
am I correct in my assertion that playing exploitively also means that you increase the chances that you can be exploited?
Well, that's what I was just saying in a different way. Okay. When I said it might backfire.
Right.
If I try to figure out how you're playing and then try to take advantage of it, and I incorrectly guessed how you're playing, then you'll beat me. So it is a little bit dangerous. But in most cases, especially if you're playing up to about 5 and 10 no limit, 5 and 10 blind no limit hold'em, or other games about that size, if you're playing up to about medium-sized stakes poker, almost certainly the people, some of the players can be easily assessed. So you're not going to get double-crossed. So exploitively is usually better.
You have a long history, David, in writing poker books, and you're one of the pioneers in teaching poker. Where do you see the future of poker learning going?
That's what it depends what games are being played. I am not, even though I wrote a book about no limit, I'm not so sure that No Limit is going to be the game of the future. I mean, one of the reasons why it has died down is because of this game theory threat. I mean, or to put it a different way, players who play game theory are very similar to computers who play. See, computers play as close to game theory as possible. And now that there is that technique of winning, as I said, it doesn't allow you to use the skill of trying to figure out what the other person has. So I think that there's a pretty good chance that we're going to be seeing different poker games, some of which I've invented and I'm in the process of trying to persuade people to play. But I think that the poker might go back to some of the old style games. I mean, 7-card stud was, for instance, a nice little game there. The only problem with 7-card stud was that you got to remember the cards that were out, or you were at a disadvantage. See, in Hold'em, there's no card memory. Game. Yeah, and I just don't know. I mean, I'm not sure what's going to happen, but I think that No Limit Hold'em for high stakes is maybe on the way out. I mean, even now, the biggest games are usually mixed games where they are playing all different games, maybe as many as 10 different games. Every half hour they switch.
Yeah, and look at the World Series of Poker, the Players' Championship, $50,000
right.
Players' Championship is mixed game format.
I mean, you can't. It's really difficult to have successful games where if you have a pocket computer that you can just you can just let the computer play for you and you become essentially unbeatable. So, excuse me. So I don't know. I really am not sure what's going to happen. I think they might go into some. I've come up with some wrinkles, various wrinkles where a computer couldn't figure out the game. It's not really that difficult to come up with some rules changes that would be beyond the ability of even today's computers to figure out how to play. And they might be limit, they might be no limit. I don't really want to get into them too much because I have some hope that maybe I can sell some of these games to some people. But there's an awful lot of different ways that you can make small changes to a game where I'll just to give you one example, and this might not even be one of the better games, but just to give an example, suppose before each hand, 5 cards were exposed, off in the corner, randomly. Every hand, 5 cards are exposed. So every hand that you play, if No Limit Hold'em is with a 47-card deck with 5 exposed cards out of play. Well, there's 2,600,000 different ways that you can put 5 cards out there. So as fast as computers are, they would if they were able to figure out great strategies in one day, now it would take them 2,600,000 days to figure out the correct strategy for every possible 5 cards exposed. You know what I'm saying? If they can, yeah. So there's lots of ways of doing that, and I think poker still is going to do well, especially because there are so many different aspects of poker that are helpful to you in other walks of life. I mean, a lot of professional poker players have gone on to become extraordinarily successful on Wall Street. Probably the best example is Jeff Yass, who started a place called Susquehanna Securities. He was a young kid. He was a professional poker player, and then he started to trade options, and now he's a billionaire. So, but there's many, many other stories like that. And so poker, I think, is always going to be with us. Even though it's a lot below its peak, it's still above where it was 30 years ago.
Wow, great. Thank you, David, so much for being with us today. The name of the book is The Theory of Poker Applied to No Limit, and it should be available by June 1st, you say, in Amazon and on 2+2?
That's right.
Bookstore?
Plus some other places, too, sure. All the places where books are sold.
Great. Thanks, David. It sounds like there's some really good information in there, and I hope everyone gets out and gets themselves a copy.
Okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Well, that's a wrap on the first special edition of the Pokerfuse Podcast. As I stated earlier on in the beginning, if anyone has any feedback on you like the format, you don't like the format, any special guests you may want to hear appear on special editions, future special editions of the Pokerfuse Podcast, please reach out. You can tweet at us at Pokerfuse. I'm at SpookyBugs. Nick is at PokerProJones. And until next time, thanks for tuning in, everyone.